My name is Hannah Lee, and I'm a fourth-year neuroscience student at the University of Calgary. This documentary was created to explore substance use and addiction from multiple perspectives, from those with lived experience, those studying its social and neurological impacts, and those working on the front lines. My hope is, by bringing these voices together, that we can spark awareness, open conversation, and inspire change.
When I started drinking, it was like automatic currency of belonging. I thought there was something deeply wrong with me because I couldn't, quote unquote, drink normally.
Approach everything with kindness because you don't know what someone is experiencing. Doesn't discriminate. There are biases out there that, we see people living on the street and they chose that life for themselves, and I would argue that nobody wants to live that way.
There's this idea that people should just be able to stop, like it's a character flaw.
Using drugs, drinking doesn't make someone a bad person.
The biggest gift of recovery is coming to the realization that I'm having more fun now than I ever did when I was in problematic use, and I wish I had got that message younger.
To say is that the best prevention actually has nothing to do with drugs. It's about intervening in everything that wraps around the child, the family, and the community.
Every time I drank, something bad didn't happen, but anytime something bad happened, alcohol was involved. I have been in recovery since November 23rd, 2013, so I'm coming up on 12 years. I struggled with substances for about 15 years. Alcohol was my drug of choice. Although I started showing patterns of addictive behavior very early on with food, using food as a coping mechanism to regulate my internal with something external. When I discovered alcohol and started really drinking in earnest during university when I was 17, that's when my binge drinking took off.
Our brain responds to all sorts of rewards in our environment. Drugs do act on our brain's kind of reward systems, but so do a lot of other things. So, food, even exercise, social interaction, all sorts of other things engage these same systems. But with drugs, they can kind of engage these systems at a much higher kind of level than some of the natural rewards. And it's when those things become kind of out of whack that you see an increase in engaging in drug-related behaviors.
Substance use varies. It increases with age, obviously, and alcohol is still the most widely used substance among youth.
I was very much part of the party culture in university. It wasn't really seen as a problem, although I did have signs of addiction, of negative consequences. Although I had a lot of difficult moments and bad things happen when I was drinking, it really gave me a sense of belonging. I always felt different. I didn't feel like I belonged to my family growing up. And when I started drinking, it was like automatic currency of belonging. You go to a party, you're invited, you drink with people, you have reduced inhibitions. This other side of me would come out that was more gregarious, more easygoing, not like more carefree. And I liked that side. So I didn't want to give up drinking because I thought that my social life would be over if I gave up drinking.
I think set and setting is a foundational harm reduction concept that a lot of folks might not be aware of, but people who are in and around drug taking scenes have heard a lot about. And this is the idea that you need to check in with your mindset, where you are when you're taking the substance, and then where you are. What's happening around you? What's the context? What's the setting? Any drug can be problematic if you're not in the right mindset or you're not in the right context. So especially for young people, encouraging them to be a little bit thoughtful and oriented to like what's happening with them and what's happening around them when they're thinking about using a substance.
So if you're taking a drug in a totally new environment where you've never had it before, you can actually be more sensitive to the effects of the drug. And then that can also lead to kind of really negative effects. So people think that they're taking a dose that they can handle, but because they're in this new environment, that dose is much stronger and they have a much more negative response to it. drugs do change your brain. However, that isn't permanent if you change those behaviors, right? So if you continue to engage in using those substances, you're going to see an exacerbation of those effects. But once you stop using drugs or you engage in different, behaviors or paths to recovery, your brain still is flexible and it can adapt and it can relearn. So I think it's important to say, well, there is some brain-based reasons why people might engage in these behaviors and have difficulty in stopping. There are also brain-based reasons why they can, change their behaviors and, engage in some sort of path to recovery.
The moment I stopped asking why I was an alcoholic was the moment I started healing. And it didn't matter anymore why, it's just that I had to accept that I had a problem and let's move forward. I got sober in 2013, so that's when I officially start my recovery journey, is the day that I stopped drinking alcohol. Although I had tried many tactics to control and enjoy my drinking, because my feeling was that I just had to get to the root of my anxiety and I would be able to, quote unquote, drink like a lady. And I could never really get there. And I think I tried all sorts of different things like moderation management, harm reduction, only drinking on weekends, only drinking beer, no hard liquor, only drinking wine, only drinking when my husband was around, only drinking at home, all of the things you can imagine. I had spreadsheets trying to control my drinking.
There isn't any one path to recovery that is going to work for everyone. People also find different success rates with the different treatments. So some people will use things like AA or Alcoholics Anonymous, where it's a really kind of peer support group. Other people will have maybe individual therapy. Some people will engage in different kind of pharmacotherapies. So it's really broad, and people kind of have to figure out what's right for them. It's very hard for us as scientists or clinicians to know what's going to work for an individual without that individual trying it. So if someone says, I've really tried to cut down my drinking, but I have a drink and then I can't stop. Well, maybe that person should be looking towards abstinence if they're unable to control kind of drinking episodes. But until someone tries that, we don't really know what to recommend. So we really have to work with, what does that person want? So what is their end goal? Is it to not drink again, or is it to just reduce the harms that alcohol is causing in their life?
I ended up going through 12 steps in AA, and that was my main recovery pathway. Also, because as a student, I had no money. I didn't come from money. I couldn't afford to go to a private rehab. And I started going to ladies' meetings, and it was really the fellowship and the community of the ladies' meetings. I would go to my Saturday morning meeting, we would go for lunch afterwards, and those ladies really cared about me, and I was accountable to them. I didn't want to let down the group.
Given all of our advances in neuroscience and the neuroscience behind addiction and substance use disorders and all these novel treatments, we still see some of the best success rates from these kind of peer support groups like AA and other things. And part of it is, due to just this idea of kind of community building and building relationships. When people have dealt with a substance use disorder for a long time, there can be, kind of guilt or shame around that. They might have, relationships that are in disrepair, and it can be really difficult to reach back out and to engage with people. Even though we have a lot of neuroscience that tells us about the brain regions and this and that, it still really is these kind of community building interventions that seem to be really helpful for people.
What we found actually is, rather than educating youth about drugs, intervening in the context where they are likely to use drugs is going to be more productive. So that's providing activities, meaningful employment, and meaningful social connection for youth. So what I like to say is that the best prevention actually has nothing to do with drugs. It's about intervening in everything that wraps around the child, the family, and the community.
The UCalgary recovery community stemmed from my own lived experience of not having any supports on campus as a student. There is a person I have to acknowledge in this story, and his name is Ben. he had invited me to a Halloween party. I had, planned on controlling my drinking. So I had like my 6-pack and that was all I was going to drink and nothing more, but it never turned out that way. And he was ladling, he had made this giant bowl of sangria and he was giving sangria out. And I noticed he wasn't drinking. So I said to him, you don't drink? And he said, oh no, I've been in recovery for 25 years. So he was the first academic I had met who was out in recovery. And he had what I wanted. He was still having fun and he was stone cold sober. So that relationship with him and planting that seed for me to know I could live my life a different way changed my life. I had therapists, but really seeing this person, he was the role model I needed in that moment to know that there would be another way to live. That's what the UCRC is to me, is having those built-in opportunities to meet bends. So not everyone will have that opportunity, but now people can come to the center and meet people who are academics, so studying, pursuing higher education, pursuing different things in their life and struggling also or in recovery, so that they can have a guide or a mentor to help them.
We're making sure that we keep things tidy.
It doesn't bother me, but I remember being terrified at the time because I didn't want anything to negatively affect my job prospects. I was really terrified of that stigma. So I hid.
Addiction faces stigma in many ways. There's this idea that people should just be able to stop, like it's a character flaw or an inability to control your behaviors. And there is evidence that some people are more susceptible to it, and there also is evidence that after repeated drug use, there are changes in the brain. It doesn't mean that that person will forever have a substance use disorder. It just means that they're going to have to, find a way to, change their behaviors, whether through kind of community-based peer support, pharmacological interventions, therapy. There are different ways to do it, but it can be challenging for someone looking on the outside who doesn't understand that this person that they used to know has now had, these various changes that have gone, right? So it's not just their brain that has changed, but their behaviors, how they're engaging with people. They might not have as much social support as they would. So all these things combine into this individual that can be challenging to understand when you're, again, looking from the outside.
It's important to know that not everyone drinks, not everyone tries drugs, but also that trying them doesn't mean that you will spiral out of control. There is a middle ground. But one problem that has been happening is that people don't actually know what drugs they are buying on the street. So there's recent data here in Calgary that shows that people may be thinking they're buying stimulants like methamphetamine or cocaine, and it actually has fentanyl in it. And fentanyl is an opioid that can cause overdoses at quite low doses, especially in people who don't usually use opioids and don't expect it to be an opioid. It's important to know that what opioids do is that they bind to certain receptors in your brain that then suppress your instinct to breathe. And so what an opioid overdose does is it stops the person from breathing, and then the lack of oxygen to the brain is what can kill them. And what naloxone does is that it actually binds better to that receptor than the opioids do, and it sort of boots them off of the receptor, and people will start breathing again. So it's called an opioid antagonist, and it can reverse overdoses and really can prevent so much harm from opioid overdoses. It's also freely available in Canada. Here in Alberta, you can access it through many pharmacies, through many community organizations. It's provided in multiple formulations, and there's no harm in giving naloxone, even if it's not an opioid overdose.
I think the important thing to remember is that substance use harms are not equally distributed at the population level. So as a public health scientist, I like to remind people that all people use drugs from various walks of life, but it's people who are more disfranchised and marginalized The harms are concentrated among these groups, and they have the compounding effects. We are now 9 years into a toxic drug poisoning emergency in Canada. Over 50,000 people have lost their lives.
Almost everybody's going to try a drug in their life of some sort. Not everybody's going to develop a substance use disorder. And we don't really know why some do and some don't. Like, we have ideas of what might make it more likely or less likely. But once it happens, we have to get past the point of, why did it happen, and figure out how to help people kind of, if they want to look towards recovery, figure out what that looks like for them. So it's just really important that people focus on not kind of how we got here, but how we kind of get out of the situation.
What's a message that you wish you'd received earlier about substance use?
I think that it's not a moral failing, that it's often a response to pain, and that it's a very human experience. There's many factors affecting addiction, and it has nothing to do with willpower. It has nothing to do with being a bad person.
People are only as healthy as their societies. It's not about what the individual is doing and what's wrong with their brain and their lack of willpower. We focus upstream, we get better outcomes across the population.
Be careful with our words, be aware of our bias, be aware of our, judgments.
There's nothing to be ashamed of. And I think that the antidote to shame is meeting someone else and connecting with them and saying, me too. But in order to say that, you need to be disclosing.
I think the big thing is to remember that everyone is human, that a couple of bad choices or a couple of structural inequalities does not define who someone is.
I think of equal importance is that prevention. So supporting our communities means making sure everybody has what they need to do well, right? Making sure parents have the support that they need to raise their kids, to keep them engaged, to keep them involved.
When we address things like lack of social inclusion, housing, unemployment, attachment to school, homophobia, racism, anti-immigrant sentiments, these are things that make people disconnected, divided, more likely to turn to substances or problematic substances for coping and support.
I'm a strong proponent of recovering out loud, with the caveat that recovering out loud doesn't have to be on TikTok or Instagram or yelling it from the rooftops. Recovering out loud can be in a private moment, like what happened with Ben and I at that party, right? But being able to share that can not only change someone's life, but in my case, save it.